To use the HDR system, you need to enable the HDR plugin. Do this via the Edit menu, Plugins, Audio, SweejTech HDR. Then you may need to restart the editor. The other thing you'll need to do is to enable the HDR source data override. This allows the HDR system to store the sound configuration data required for the authoring workflow. So edit Project Settings, choose your platform, in this case Windows, and in the Audio menu enable the SweejTech HDR Audio Source Data Override plugin. While you're here in the project settings, go to SweejTech HDR. Here you can configure your default settings. Unless you've got a specific use case in mind, we'd recommend keeping those at these default values until you're in a position to audition and adjust them to your needs. Now you can configure the directories to include or exclude. By default, the HDR system includes all of the sounds in your project. However, you might want to specify particular folders to include or exclude when first setting up. For example, you may want to specify the root audio or sound folder in your project to avoid including irrelevant audio assets that might appear in the rest of the project. Once you define a directory here, the system no longer looks at the whole project folder. Now, if we open up the HDR Authoring window, we can see that all the sound assets within the included folder and any subfolders within it are shown. Although we can filter this list by name, it's worth also thinking about folders that you might want to exclude from the HDR system. For example, here we might have a folder with 40,000 dialog files in, and we can see them within the authoring window since this is a subfolder of the audio folder which we've just included. But perhaps these VO files are always played back by this meta sound. So actually we could exclude this folder from the HDR system which will mean that those assets are no longer cluttering up our HDR windows. Once the appropriate directories are included or excluded from the HDR system, we can then enable or disable HDR and adjust settings for each asset via the HDR authoring window. Or we can do this directly within the assets themselves via the SweejTech HDR drop-down menu.